Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I am very interested in society, politics, and culture, which means that I'm also very interested in Canada, the country where I live. If you ask me, it only makes sense for people interested in society, politics, and culture to spend a lot of time thinking about the society, politics, and culture of their country, because that is our best glimpse into how these concepts play out in the real world. I like talking about Canada because Canada is one of the primary frames through which I view the world. But what is weird to me is how few of my fellow Canadians here on YouTube seem to feel the same way. Canadian YouTubers, by and large, do not tend to talk about Canada very often, even if they're YouTubers who specialize in social, political, or cultural commentary. Indeed, I feel like a pretty common experience on this site is being surprised to learn that a creator is Canadian at all, unless you're pretty good at noticing subtle accents. Now, Canada is obviously a bit of a unique place as far as these sorts of things go, because we are so similar to the United States. I myself have made the argument many times on this channel that Canada and the US are part of a single American continental cultural civilization, and that it's appropriate to use the term American when describing the many cultural things that we share. Canadians have a long history as both critics and creators of American art, movies, music, philosophy, and social movements, so it's natural to consider such things part of our culture too, and feel no friction or alienation towards them. It makes sense, in other words, that Canadian YouTubers would spend most of their time talking about these things. But all that said, even the two most similar countries in the world are still two different countries, and the mere fact of inhabiting the smaller and less powerful of the two, I believe, has had a very unique psychological effect on Canadians. The question of what being a sort of American does to Canadians' sense of self is a very studied topic in this country that a lot of great books have been written on. But it's also a topic that is being explored a lot less among the Canadian YouTuber commentator class than I must say I first expected when I started my channel 9 years ago. But you don't need to take my word for it. I wanted to test this observation as empirically as I could. So with the help of you guys, I assembled a list of 10 Canadian creators who could be fairly described as running among the most popular and influential commentary channels on this site. And I decided to see how often they talk about Canada. So I went through all of the videos that they posted in 2023 and searched for any references to Canada, Canadians, or any other identifiably Canadian topics. And here is what I found. Alrighty, so probably the most popular Canadian commentary type channel out there is good old Curtis Connor, everybody's favorite. Curtis is a fun and funny guy living in Toronto, and he makes videos about weird fads, pop culture nonsense, and fringe internet micro celebrities. He made 18 videos in 2023, and within that 18, 3 contained mentions of Canada. In one video, he mentions that a TikTok psychic that he's dunking on comes from Manitoba, which he then explains this way for the benefit of his foreign viewers.
Manitoba is like where a Dark Souls boss battle takes place, dude. It sucks. And if you're in Manitoba right now watching my videos, you know, you're subscribed and stuff, I don't mean to offend you or anything, you know, it's just joking around, but also at the same time, move.
In another one, he tries to participate in the flavored water fad and says that his local Canadian Walmart has a worse selection of flavor syrups than the Walmarts do in the US.
Unfortunately, we didn't have all the crazy Sonic, Skittles, 7-Up flavors at our Walmart because Canada has rules and laws about what is safe to put in our bodies.
And lastly, in a review of a terrible Christmas movie, he mentions how the place that he ordered it from wouldn't ship the DVD to Canada, so he had to get his manager to ship it from the States. I mean, he also once mentioned Canada in the context of a VPN ad, and he once mentioned that he was doing a live show in Montreal, but that's it. Next up, we have Mudahar, better known as Some Ordinary Gamers. He lives in Toronto as well, I believe. I actually met him earlier this year at VidCon. We spoke briefly at a party, but didn't really make much of a connection beyond that. Mudahar's body of work is pretty intimidating to analyze because he makes a video almost every day and talks about a huge variety of topics. I didn't have time to review the over 300 videos he made in 2023, but I did check out a couple where the title made me think that there was probably a high chance that something Canada-related came up. And here are a few of the biggest examples that I found. He made one video where he talked about that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, which he worried would cause chemical gas to leak into southern Ontario, which is where he lives. He made a video about the Canadian government's decision to ban TikTok on the phones of public employees, which he supported.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, Canada, for all the mistakes my country makes, I love it, and sometimes it makes the right choice.
He did not, however, support the US government's plan to force the sale of TikTok, which he described from his Canadian perspective this way.
The reason why I'm invested into it, and you might be like, but Muda, you're Canadian. I might be Canadian, but that doesn't involve the fact that now I do go back and forth between the states as well. I have a tax thing in the states. I have work in the states. I'm pretty much involved in the states as well. I go back and forth. And also, let's not forget the fact that if these kind of laws pass in the United States, it's not going to be hard for it to eventually pass in Canada, okay? We're kind of like best friends, we're best buds, eh?
He also made a funny video where he complained a bit about how people were vandalizing the Canadian flag on r/place. And he made a couple of videos about the Trudeau administration's infamous Bills C11 and C18, which were efforts to regulate the Canadian internet in various ways that Mudahar opposed.
And we don't really care for it. Any Canadian creator that's falling for the Kool-Aid doesn't actually understand how bad this is. If you want to succeed in the global village, you have to compete with the global village.
Mudahar is very interested in a lot of issues relating to online security and privacy, and the degree that corporations and government should both not be trusted. And even though he mostly analyzes these issues as they manifest in the US, he does sometimes mention that Canadians shouldn't be complacent, either because Canadian data will also be affected, or because he thinks, like he said in that earlier clip, that Canadian policy inevitably follows that of the US. I don't know how true that is, but it's definitely rhetoric that you hear a lot from Canadians like him who are interested in the things that he is. All right, next up we got another super prolific channel, Abba and Preach. Abba and Preach are two guys based out of Montreal who also do videos almost every day, mostly reacting to celebrity drama, viral videos, and I would say broadly culture war type stuff involving debates over race, gender, and sex. Basically the sorts of topics that a certain kind of younger man is very interested in. I didn't watch all of their 2023 videos either, just because once again, there are hundreds of them, but I think I watched enough to get a decent sample. Like Mudahar, they passively mention that they live in Canada once in a while in their videos, usually in the context of noting small US-Canadian differences that might come up now and then. In a video that involved drinking, for instance, they mentioned in passing that the legal drinking age in Canada is lower than it is in the US.
In Canada, you can. Not in British Columbia, it's 19, but the rest of us is 18.
While in one where they were talking about a guy who got shot, they made a passing mention of how self-defense laws are different in Canada. But even moments like these seem to be relatively rare. By my count, they made just 3 videos in 2023 that were explicitly about Canadian topics. One was just a general compare and contrast between the US and Canada.
One thing that America doesn't do well that we do amazing up here, you ready? Tap water.
Truly one of the great low-hanging fruits for any Canadian content creator. Hey, we've all done it. The second was about schools in Canada celebrating Pride Month, which was a topic of some conservative outrage last year, and they weighed in to that debate. Now, the third was really interesting because it was about the French supremacist language laws of Quebec, which is where they live. This is a very important and very distinctly Canadian political issue. And as young English-speaking Black Quebecers, they have a very unique perspective on it, which I think makes for a very interesting video.
Because I know where this is going.
I know.
And you haven't gone there.
I know. Speaking to someone that speaks English, it's friends. We're not in the work environment. We're not at school, right? We're just in a bus and I'm speaking French. I'm speaking English. And because I speak English with that accent and not their accent, they assume I don't speak French, and I can assure you, my French accent. If we talk about the accents in Quebec, my French accent is Quebec. So I speak to my friend, and a motherfucker's gonna tap me on the shoulders like, "Hey, parle en français, on est au Québec, Sid." And I turn around, and I'm like, "Ouais, pis ça, pourquoi tu veux savoir de quoi que je parle? Pourquoi tu veux savoir? Hostie, aujourd'hui, tabarnak, qu'est-ce qui se passe en moi et mon chum?"
Easily the best Canadians talking about Canada video I came across during this whole audit. Next up, StrangeOns. StrangeOns is from Toronto and mostly makes videos analyzing weird subcultures and internet trends. She did not make any videos about explicitly Canadian topics in 2023. In a few of her videos, she mentions Canada in passing, but this is usually just in reference to a thing that took place in Canada as part of some larger list of examples of whatever cultural phenomenon she's talking about. Her two most substantial mentions come in one video where she makes a quick critical remark about the Canadian healthcare system.
Our entire mental health care system is disastrously broken. I'm not American, by the way, but I will lump Canada in there. Not great either.
And a different one where she mentions that despite being Canadian, she was very emotionally invested in the outcome of the 2020 US presidential election.
Even in Canada, kind of felt like we were all gonna die if we had to live through another 4 years of Trump. Huge world event of massive significance was happening.
In a couple of her ad reads, she mentions being from Canada as well, with the most interesting one being an ad for a language learning app where she talks self-consciously about her lack of French fluency.
I'm using it to brush up on my French, one of the official languages of my home country of Canada. My parents are from Montreal. They speak French. My entire family speaks French, but can I speak French? No.
Next, Sisyphus55. I know Sisyphus pretty well. We hung out a few times in Montreal, where he lives, and I went on his podcast once. He makes these very distinctive animated videos about moral and philosophical topics. In 2023, he did not make any videos about explicitly Canadian topics. All of Sisyphus's mentions of Canada occurred in the context of his podcast interviews, which he posts on his main channel, and I included in his audit as a result. In a couple of interviews with American guests, the guest will sometimes say something like, "Do you have this problem in Canada?" And there will be a brief discussion about that, although sometimes it's basically just him saying, "Yeah," and they quickly move on. The most substantial instance of this was a digression about Indigenous rights in Canada in his podcast with Camila Nobile.
No matter which government comes in, they always promise to do things and they never really do anything, like really poor water quality and huge substance abuse issues and just...
So they have been very separate, from they hadn't been honoring them, for example. They have been very separate from society. They have no laws or something that protects them at their land also.
Kind of there's some laws, but then those laws also there is a sort of racism in Canada.
But overall, the mentions tend to be fleeting. Allis Sunva is yet another YouTuber from Toronto. She makes pretty standard talk to the camera videos about social, cultural issues from a philosophical perspective. I once hung out with her, along with a couple of other Toronto YouTubers when I was visiting that city last year. In 2023, she did not make any videos about specifically Canadian topics. She actually only made 7 videos in all last year, which made her audit easy. Canada came up in passing in 3 of those 7 videos. In one video, Canada is mentioned in a quote that she reads from a Canadian academic, comparing and contrasting ideas of love in Victorian England to ideas of love in modern-day Canada. Though in the context of the quote, Canada is just sort of standing in for the modern West. In another video, she mentions Prime Minister Trudeau as an example of a very image-conscious world leader.
Or they know Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as the zaddy of world leaders.
And she makes a joke about the Canadian musician Headley going to prison as an example of a news event that Canadians might know.
I can't believe you didn't know Headley got sent to jail. Are you even Canadian? I really hope other Canadians got that reference.
And in a third video, she mentions the amount of money that Canada spent attempting to rescue the Ocean Gate submarine, and gives a brief mention of Canada's Indian residential schools as examples in a larger discussion about the different ways that human life is valued or not.
When thousands of indigenous children were being killed in residential schools, why did the residential school teachers and administrators leave scot-free? Why did it take decades for the government and the larger public to condemn what happened?
Next up, Folding Ideas. Folding Ideas is the name of a channel run by a guy called Dan Olson, who describes himself as a Alberta-based documentarian making videos on a broad range of subjects. He is one of those guys who almost never releases a video, but when he does, it is several hours long and quickly gets millions of views, which also made him really easy to audit. He made just 3 videos in 2023. The first one contains no mentions of Canada at all. The second one contains a very fleeting reference to Canada, when Dan quotes an article that cites the Canadian natural resource market as an example of an industry that has been affected by short selling, which is one of the main topics of that particular video.
GameStop was the victim of a malicious short attack, the exact same thing that is happening to the Canadian mining sector.
And the third one also contains no mentions of Canada. If I was including myself in this audit, my channel would fall around here in terms of general popularity. So in the interests of accountability, let's see how I would do. I made 46 videos in 2023. 14 of them were about explicitly Canadian topics, including the Canadian-India diplomatic crisis, a general update on the Canadian political situation, a few Q&A Canada fact videos, and a few videos documenting my battle against the Trudeau government's internet regulations. In 8 other videos I made on non-explicitly Canadian topics, I nevertheless spent at least some time discussing a Canadian angle or sharing some insight I have on the topic from my perspective as a Canadian. Another example could be found in a political issue that we've been talking a lot about in Canada recently, which is reconciliation with the Native Canadians. So overall, close to half of my 2023 videos feature moderate to heavy Canadian content. I'm definitely an extreme outlier as far as this kind of thing goes, but I of course have made being the Canada guy a big part of my YouTube brand. Next up, we got The Plain Bagel, which is a channel run by Richard Coffin, an investment analyst from Ottawa, who mostly talks about economic issues. Of the 32 videos he made in 2023, he made 1 video about an explicitly Canadian topic. This one, which is all about the Canadian housing crisis, which is probably the single largest issue facing the Canadian economy at the moment.
But in the near term, these same rate hikes have actually exacerbated the affordability problem.
Beyond that, in a couple of videos, he seems to presume that his audience contains a fair number of Canadians. So once in a while, he will casually mention the Canadian equivalent of some financial thing when it's appropriate. So for example, when he mentions Zelle, he will say, or Interact, if you're in Canada, in terms of some of his more substantial Canada references. In a video on Credit Suisse, he mentions briefly that they don't have a presence in Canada. In a video on dividends, he talks a little bit about how they're taxed differently in Canada. And in a video about the future of the US dollar, he compares the Chinese yuan to the Canadian dollar as examples of less important global currencies, and he later makes a joke about making the Canadian dollar the world's new reserve currency.
I'm actually advocating that we change that title and bring it over to the Canadian dollar, given our relative stability, our politeness, and that every dollar is backed in Canada by a Timmy's double-double.
Interestingly enough, much like StrangeOn's, he also expresses self-consciousness about his lack of French fluency during an ad for a language learning app.
A quick sort of fun fact that you probably don't know about me, both my parents are actually from the Gaspé Coast, which is the far tip of Canada's French-speaking province, Quebec. Thing is, despite growing up around a lot of French at home, I was never really fluent, and I never really wanted to learn French as a kid.
If you're ever wondering why I have never made an ad for a language learning app, that's why. All right, and last on our list, we've got Kadija Boa. They are yet another Toronto-based creator and describe their content as pop culture meets politics, meets media, meets philosophy, meets chaos. Kadija made 28 videos in 2023, which cover a bunch of different topics relating to sex and race and gender and politics and culture. They didn't make any videos that were primarily about a Canadian topic, and there were only a few passing mentions of Canada in the rest of their videos. In a video on Pick Me Girls, they interview some people on the street, and at one point they speak to this woman who comes from a small town, and this exchange occurs.
I grew up in a really small town, and the main form of entertainment is like tailgate parties and going four-wheeling, you know? So there's a lot of that energy where I grew up, and
it was Alberta, wasn't it?
Nova Scotia.
Same difference.
Good guess, though. I'm kidding. Yeah.
In their video on breasts, Kadija briefly compares and contrasts American and Canadian laws regarding toplessness. And the most substantial mention comes in a video about biracial identity. This one contains a pretty substantial discussion of Kadija's identity as a Gambian immigrant to the United States who later moved to Canada, and the ways in which this string of migrations has affected their sense of belonging. There's a bit of talk about how Canada and America conceptualize the idea of blackness in the same way. And at one point they make a comment that you sometimes hear from Black Canadians, which is that the blunt American style of racism is in some ways preferable to the indirect Canadian style.
And I will say, at least in America, at least in the South, people were way more upfront with you. Canada, people just love to be passive aggressive about it. The microaggression was invented in Canada.
Alrighty, so there we go. According to my comprehensive audit, the top 10 Canadian commentary channels do not talk much about Canada at all. Out of all of them, the one that you might reliably expect to get the most Canadian content out of would probably be Mudahar, although I also feel like the plain bagel has been making more of a pivot to Canadian content lately. I mean, he got to interview Prime Minister Trudeau back in May, which is pretty big. But overall, it's mostly fair to conclude that even the most elite tier of opinionated Canadian YouTubers, the ones who present themselves as having the most to say about the state of the world, generally do not have much to say about the country in which they live. I don't want to speculate too much about why this is. The Occam's razor explanation would just be that these channels don't talk much about Canadian stuff because they don't think their audience will be that interested in it, and that's fine. These people are all very successful, so it's hardly my place to tell them that they're doing anything wrong. I do think, however, that my success has shown that audiences, and especially American audiences, actually have quite a large appetite for Canada-related videos, and that Canadian content creators should not be too quick to make what I think is a common condescending assumption, namely that Americans are incapable of caring about countries outside of the US. The other thing I would say is that Canadian YouTube is currently under an unprecedented threat from the Canadian government, which is seeking to regulate it in a more propagandistic and patriotic direction via the new powers it has gained through Bill C-11. While I think that this initiative is undemocratic and dangerous, the steelman counter-argument would say that there is a legitimate dearth of high-quality content about Canada currently available on YouTube, and that government has an obligation to correct market failures. I don't personally buy that argument because, as I said at the beginning of this video, I believe in a very broad definition of Canadian culture that includes most American things. I think that all of these channels are fine examples of Canadian culture. But I do know that the case for nationalistic regulation is a much easier argument for government to make when the internet feels starved of Canadian content of a more specific sort, which is to say people talking about Canadian current events or Canadian politics or explicitly analyzing things from the perspective of a citizen of the nation state of Canada and all of the unique psychology that that entails. Anyway, I would be curious to hear what you guys think about all of this. Is this something that you have noticed about Canadian content creators? How rarely they talk about Canada? Is it maybe even something you've noticed about non-American creators in general? Can you think of any exceptions? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.